November 15, 1917. A cramped study in Reich, Germany. The scratching of a pen against cheap paper is the only sound fighting the oppressive silence of the room. 20-year-old Paul Joseph Goebbels stares out the window at the grey, weeping sky. His knuckles white as he grips the desk edge. Pain shoots up his right leg. A familiar, throbbing reminder of the clubfoot that has twisted his stride and his destiny since childhood. While his contemporaries are dying in the mud of Flanders for the Kaiser, he is trapped here, waging a war solely within his own tortured mind. He shifts his weight, the special metal brace on his shriveled leg clinking softly against the chair leg. This deformity is his badge of shame, a cruel joke played by nature that the doctors call osteomyelitis. It has garnered him nothing but pity from women and ridicule from his peers, fueling a burning furnace of resentment deep in his gut. He despises the healthy, the strong, and the ordinary people who walk without a limp. Since he cannot command respect through physical prowess, he has decided he will force the world to kneel before the sheer, terrified power of his intellect. By 1921, the young man has transformed his physical inadequacies into academic armor at the University of Heidelberg. He immerses himself in history, literature, and philosophy, devouring texts with a voracious hunger that borders on obsession. Professor Friedrich Gundolf, a Jewish scholar whom Goebbels begrudgingly admires, guides his doctoral thesis on romantic drama. Here in the hallowed halls of academia, the limp matters less than the sharpness of his tongue and the bite of his pen. He dreams of becoming a celebrated author, a literary titan whose words will save Germany from the spiritual decay he sees festering in the streets. But the Germany of 1923 cares little for romantic dramas or the aspirations of a grandiose doctor of philosophy. The Weimar Republic is collapsing under the weight of hyperinflation, where a wheelbarrow of marks buys a single loaf of stale bread. Goebbels sends his manuscripts to publisher after publisher, only to receive a stack of cold rejection letters in return. The editors, many of whom he notes with rising bile are Jewish, do not see his genius. He stands in breadlines with the unemployed masses, his coat threadbare, watching the French occupy the Ruhr and the nation crumble into humiliation. Starving and radicalized by failure, he drifts toward the Völkisch movement, seeking a scapegoat for his own misery and his nation's disgrace. He begins to attend political meetings in smoke-filled beer cellars, listening to angry men scream about international finance and the betrayal of the Treaty of Versailles. It is here that he finds a vocabulary for his hatred. The November criminals and the Jewish Bolsheviks become the architects of his suffering. He realizes that his personal rejection is merely a microcosm of Germany's rejection by the world, and he begins to yearn for a savior who can reverse this cosmic injustice. The diary becomes his only confidant during these dark months. In these pages, he pours out a torrent of narcissism and despair. He writes of suicide, of his longing for love, and his hatred for the bourgeois society that shuns him. These journals reveal a man deeply divided, swinging wildly between a sense of divine purpose and crushing depression. He crafts his own image on these pages, acting as the sole audience for his own life drama. He is rehearsing for a public that does not yet exist, sharpening the rhetoric that will one day burn down a continent. In 1924, a name begins to circulate among the disaffected radicals of the Rhineland: Adolf Hitler. The man is currently sitting in Landsberg prison for a failed coup in Munich, but his ideas are spreading like a virus through the underground press. Goebbels gets his hands on copies of the Völkischer Beobachter, the Nazi Party newspaper. He reads the articles with a skepticism that quickly turns to fascination. Here is a movement that combines the socialist concern for the worker with a ferocious, uncompromising nationalism. It speaks to his desire for revolution, not just a change of government, but a total spiritual rebirth. He joins the National Socialist German Workers' Party, receiving membership number 8,762. However, the party is fractured. In the north, under Gregor Strasser, the sentiment is revolutionary and socialist. Skeptical of the Munich leadership's alignment with wealthy industrialists, Goebbels throws his lot in with Strasser, using his typewriter to churn out blistering articles that attack capitalism as viciously as they attack communism. He becomes Strasser's secretary, traveling through the industrial Rhinelands, speaking to workers with a voice that is beginning to find its terrifying cadence. He discovers he has a gift. He can make the mob feel exactly what he feels. The tension between the Northern Socialists and the Munich faction comes to a head in 1926 at the Bamberg Conference. Hitler calls the meeting to bring the rebellious Northern leaders to heel. Goebbels travels south, his diary entries revealing a man torn between loyalty to his socialist ideals and a strange, magnetic pull toward the Munich leader. He expects a debate, a clash of intellects where the Northern faction will assert its dominance. Instead, he walks into a masterclass of political theater designed to crush dissent, not with logic, but with the sheer force of personality. February 14, 1926. Bamberg. The hall is packed with party functionaries, the air thick with tension and tobacco smoke. Hitler takes the podium and speaks for hours, dismantling the Northern program point by point. Goebbels watches, mesmerized, as his arguments for a proletarian alliance with Russia are swept away by Hitler's vision of acquiring living space in the East. He feels small, defeated, and yet strangely exhilarated. Hitler does not argue like a politician, he prophesies like a messiah. Goebbels realizes that Strasser is merely a man of organization, but Hitler is a man of destiny. The psychological capitulation is total. In his diary, Goebbels writes of the experience with the fervor of a religious convert, declaring that he loves Hitler, the future Führer, sensing the younger man's desperate need for a father figure and recognition. Plays him perfectly. He invites Goebbels to Munich, embracing him and forgiving his past transgressions against the Munich leadership. They walk together in the snow, and Hitler speaks of architecture and art, appealing to the frustrated artist within Goebbels. The little doctor is seduced not just by the power, but by the personal attention of the man he now considers Germany's savior. The return to the north is marked by a cold betrayal. Goebbels turns his back on Gregor Strasser and his former comrades, aligning himself completely with the Hitler myth. He begins to adopt Hitler's mannerisms, his pauses, and his absolute intolerance for dissent. The socialist rhetoric remains in his speeches, but now it is subservient to the Führer principle. He attacks his old friends with the same venom he once reserved for the establishment. He has found his role not the leader, but the herald, the voice that will translate the Führer's will into the language of the masses. As he sheds his old allegiances, his speaking style transforms. He learns to use his hands, long and skeletal, to punctuate the air. He masters the art of the pause, letting silence build tension in the room until it is nearly unbearable, only to shatter it with a crescendo of accusations. He realizes that truth is irrelevant in this arena. Emotion is the only currency that matters. He observes how the eyes of the women in the front rows widen when he speaks of sacrifice and blood. He is becoming a master of the microphone before he even owns one. Hitler recognizes the potential in this limping intellectual with the deep, baritone voice. The party is stagnant in Berlin, a city known as Red Berlin because of the overwhelming dominance of the Communists and Social Democrats. The NSDAP in the capital is a disorganized, chaotic mess of brawlers with no discipline. Hitler needs a man who can clean up the Augean stables, someone who fears nothing and can outshout the Marxists on their own turf. He looks at Goebbels and sees the perfect instrument for this dangerous task. He offers him the position of Gauleiter of Berlin. It is a suicide mission, and Goebbels knows it. Berlin is a grinder that chews up right-wing agitators, but it is also the center of media, culture, and power in Germany. If he can conquer Berlin, he can conquer the Reich. He packs his meager belongings, leaving the provinces behind for the electric chaos of the metropolis. He is no longer just a rejected author or a crippled observer. He is now a commander on the front lines of a political war. He accepts the challenge with a grim determination, ready to unleash violence. November 1926. The train pulls into the bustling station in Berlin, steaming and hissing. Goebbels steps onto the platform, blending into the rush of millions. The city is a cacophony of jazz, cabaret, political street fighting, and avant-garde art. It represents everything he hates: modernism, Jewish influence, sexual liberation, and everything he desires to control. He looks at the grey streets and the red flags hanging from the tenement windows in the working-class districts. He smiles grimly. He has brought a sword to this city, and he intends to use it to carve his name into history. The stage is set for a brutal confrontation. The rejected intellectual has found his messiah and his mission. He is armed with a new faith and the backing of Adolf Hitler. As he settles into the chaotic, disorganized Nazi headquarters in a basement in the Potsdamer Strasse, Joseph Goebbels is no longer the limping boy from Reich. He is the go-lighter. He prepares his first move, not knowing that the blood he is about to spill on these pavements will pave the road to the Chancellery. The battle for the soul of Berlin is about to begin. Berlin in late 1926 is a sprawling industrial beast that breathes smoke and radicalism. To the casual observer, it is the cultural capital of Europe, a city of avant-garde cinema, jazz clubs, and scientific breakthroughs. But Joseph Goebbels sees only a fortress of Marxism that must be breached. The Berlin branch of the Nazi Party is a pathetic shambles when he arrives, consisting of a few hundred quarrelsome members who spend more time fighting each other than the communists. They possess no discipline, no funding, and worst of all, no attention from the press. Goebbels immediately recognizes that in a city of 4 million people, silence is death. He decides that if the Nazis cannot yet be loved, they must at least be feared, or at the very least, noticed. He begins by ruthlessly purging the party ranks of the coffeehouse intellectuals and the lazy functionaries who treat the movement as a hobby. He demands total obedience and fanatical commitment, declaring that he needs men who are willing to conquer the streets or die trying. He turns his attention to the Sturmabteilung, the SA, who are currently a ragtag group of brawlers in mismatched uniforms. He sees in them the raw material for a political army. Under his command, the SA is not just a protection squad. They are a provocation unit designed to march into the darkest, reddest districts of Berlin and pick fights they have no business winning. He wants blood because blood makes headlines. The first major test of this strategy comes on February 11, 1927, when Goebbels rents the Ferris Hall in the Wedding District. This area is the heart of Red Berlin, a communist stronghold where the hammer and sickle hangs from every other window. It is a deliberate, calculated insult to the German Communist Party, the KPD. The communists take the bait, filling the hall with their agitators, confident they will crush the small band of Nazis. Goebbels stands on the stage, his small frame dwarfed by the cavernous room, and begins to speak. As expected, the first beer stein flies through the air, signaling the start of the chaos. The hall erupts into a violent melee as hundreds of communists storm the stage. Chairs are smashed, brass knuckles connect with jaws, and blood splatters onto the floorboards. But Goebbels has prepared his stormtroopers well. Despite being outnumbered, the SA fight with a savage, disciplined desperation that shocks their opponents. They hold the stage, beating back wave after wave of attackers until the police finally intervene to clear the hall. Goebbels, shaken but exhilarated, watches the carnage with the eye of a director. He knows that tonight, the Nazi Party in Berlin has been baptized in fire. The next day, the papers are full of the story, exactly as he planned. Following the battle at Ferris Hall, Goebbels utilizes the injuries of his men as potent propaganda tools. He visits the wounded stormtroopers in the hospital, wrapping them in bandages and glorifying their scars as badges of honor for the fatherland. He creates the myth of the unknown SA man, transforming street thugs into martyrs for a holy cause. The logic is twisted but effective. If these men are willing to bleed for this movement, it must be something worth fighting for. Recruitment soars. Young men, unemployed and angry, flock to the party that promises them action, camaraderie, and a chance to strike back at a world that has rejected them. However, the violence brings a swift crackdown from the authorities. The Berlin police chief bans the Nazi Party in the capital, forbidding Goebbels from speaking in public. Silenced but not defeated, he shifts his battlefield from the podium to the printing press. In July 1927, he founds his own newspaper, Der Angriff, the Attack. The paper is a reflection of its creator, aggressive, witty, and entirely unburdened by the truth. On the front page, he adopts the motto, "For the oppressed against the exploiters," stealing the class warfare rhetoric of the communists to lure the workers away from Marxism. Goebbels needs a villain to focus the anger of his readers, and he finds the perfect target in Dr. Bernhard Weiss, the Jewish deputy chief of police in Berlin. Goebbels launches a campaign of relentless, childish bullying against Weiss. He refuses to use the man's real name, referring to him only as Isidor to emphasize his Jewish heritage. He publishes caricatures depicting Weiss as a grotesque, ape-like figure, blaming him for everything from the police crackdown to the poor weather. It is a strategy of dehumanization. By mocking the representative of the law, Goebbels erodes respect for the Weimar Republic itself, turning the state authority into a punchline. The ban on the party is eventually lifted, and Goebbels returns to the streets with renewed ferocity. He orchestrates marches through the communist neighborhoods of Neukölln and Moabit, deliberately scheduling them on days when the tension is highest. The sight of the brown-shirted columns marching in lockstep, singing their aggressive anthems, acts as a psychological weapon. It tells the residents of these districts that the state has lost control and that a new power is rising. The ensuing riots are part of the show. Goebbels writes in his diary that the propaganda of the deed is worth more than 1 million pamphlets. Every broken window and bloody nose serves to polarize the city, forcing people to choose a side. By 1928, the Nazi Party is still a fringe element in national politics, polling miserably in the general elections. However, the system allows Goebbels to win a seat in the Reichstag. He views his election not as a mandate to govern, but as an opportunity to sabotage democracy from within. He famously declares, "We enter the Reichstag to arm ourselves with the weapons of democracy from its own arsenal. We come as enemies, as the wolf bursts into the flock. So we come." He uses his parliamentary immunity to avoid prosecution for his slanderous articles and speeches, mocking the very institution that pays his salary. While he wars with the government, Goebbels continues to cultivate the aesthetic of the Nazi movement. He understands that politics is theater. He designs uniforms, designs standards, and choreographs the rituals of the party rallies. He insists on the standardization of the Heil Hitler greeting, turning it into a ubiquitous symbol of loyalty. He brings his love of opera and drama into the political sphere, using lighting and music to manipulate the emotions of the crowd. A Nazi rally under Goebbels is not a meeting, it is a religious revival, where the faithful surrender their individuality to the collective will of the Volk. Amidst this street war, a young man named Horst Wessel catches Goebbels' attention. Wessel is a law student and a pastor's son who has dropped out of university to lead an SA storm unit in the rough neighborhood of Friedrichshain. He is the ideal Aryan poster boy, young, handsome, educated, and fanatical. He lives among the poor, sharing their hardships and organizing the stormtroopers with a missionary zeal. Wessel also writes poetry and songs for the movement. Goebbels sees in Wessel the bridge between the bourgeois and the working class, the very embodiment of the National Socialist synthesis. But the reality of Wessel's life is grittier than the poster. He lives with a former prostitute, and his death in January 1930 is the result of a sordid dispute with her landlady, who calls on her communist friends for help. A communist gunman named Albrecht Höhler knocks on Wessel's door and shoots him in the face. Wessel lingers in the hospital for weeks, fighting for his life. For Goebbels, this tragedy is a gift from the gods of propaganda. He rushes to the hospital, not just to comfort the dying man, but to direct the narrative. He begins to canonize Wessel before his heart has even stopped beating. Goebbels scrubs the story clean of its seedy details. The dispute over rent and a prostitute is erased. Instead, Wessel is portrayed as a political soldier assassinated by the cowardly subhumans of the Communist Party. Goebbels publishes daily updates on Wessel's condition in Der Angriff, building a nationwide vigil. When Wessel finally dies on February 23, 1930, Goebbels declares that his spirit has ascended to join the pantheon of German heroes. He organizes a funeral that brings Berlin to a standstill, a procession of thousands marching past the gravesite, while communists scream abuse from the cemetery walls. At the funeral, Goebbels delivers a eulogy that cements the myth. He speaks of Wessel not as a man, but as a symbol of the sacrificial youth of Germany. He frames the death as a call to arms, demanding that the movement avenge their fallen comrade. The song that Wessel had written, Die Fahne hoch, the flag high, is performed with solemn grandeur. Goebbels elevates this simple marching tune into the sacred hymn of the Nazi Party. It becomes the Horst Wessel Lied, the second national anthem of the Third Reich, sung with arms raised in salute. The elevation of Horst Wessel marks the maturing of Goebbels' propaganda machine. He has proven that he can take a sordid street murder and transmute it into a religious experience. The violence of 1929 and the economic crash that follows the Great Depression create fertile ground for his message. The Weimar Republic is paralyzed, and the streets belong to the men with the loudest voices and the hardest fists. Goebbels has turned the Berlin SA into a formidable fighting force and has established a media empire that spreads his poison daily. As the 1,920 seconds bleed into the 1,930 seconds, the atmosphere in Berlin shifts from chaotic to apocalyptic. The Great Depression hits Germany with the force of a sledgehammer, throwing millions out of work. The despair that Goebbels felt in 1923 is now felt by the entire nation. He looks out at the breadlines and the angry mobs, and he smiles. The time for street brawls is ending. The time for the seizure of power is beginning. He has sharpened his knife in the alleys of Berlin, and now he is ready to plunge it into the heart of the Republic. September 14, 1930. The teletype machines in the newsrooms of Berlin chatter with a frantic rhythm, spitting out results that send shockwaves through the fragile foundations of the Weimar Republic. Joseph Goebbels sits in the nerve center of the Nazi Party, surrounded by cigarette smoke and the smell of stale coffee, watching the numbers climb with a predatory grin. 2 years ago, the National Socialists were a laughingstock with only 12 seats in the Reichstag. Tonight, the count rises to 107. They are suddenly the second largest political force in Germany. The establishment politicians are paralyzed with horror. But Goebbels knows this is not a fluke. It is the harvest of the misery he has so carefully cultivated. The Great Depression has hit Germany harder than any other nation, turning the country into a breeding ground for radicalism. The unemployment lines snake around city blocks, filled with men whose eyes are hollowed by hunger and humiliation. Goebbels understands that a starving man does not care about the nuances of parliamentary democracy. He cares about bread and dignity. The propaganda machine shifts gears, moving from the specific grievances of the beer halls to a broad, emotional appeal that targets the despondency of the nation. The slogan is simple and devastating: work and bread. Goebbels positions Hitler not just as a politician, but as the only man strong enough to break the chains of the Versailles Treaty and economic slavery. With the new influx of parliamentary seats comes a surge of funding and legitimacy. But Goebbels has no intention of playing by the rules of the Reichstag. When the new session opens in October 1930, the Nazi deputies march into the chamber wearing their brown SA uniforms, a direct violation of the dress code and a visual declaration of war on the system. They answer roll call not with present, but with Heil Hitler. The foreign press watches in disbelief as the legislative heart of Germany is turned into a theatre of intimidation. Goebbels, immune from prosecution, uses the floor of the parliament to mock the Republic, turning every session into a chaotic spectacle that proves the government's impotence. By 1932, the political stakes escalate to the highest office in the land. The presidential election pits the unknown corporal, Adolf Hitler, against the legendary Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. It is a battle between the future and the past. Goebbels faces a tactical nightmare how to attack Hindenburg, a living icon of German history, without alienating the conservative voters who revere him. He devises a strategy of honoring the old while voting for the young. He paints Hindenburg as a senile, tragic figure held captive by a corrupt system, while presenting Hitler as the dynamic force of nature required to save the nation from collapse. To bridge the gap between Hitler and the millions of voters spread across Germany, Goebbels unleashes a campaign of unprecedented modernity. He charters a Junkers Ju-52 airplane, emblazoned with the slogan, "Hitler over Germany." At a time when air travel is still a novelty, the image of the Führer descending from the clouds is potent psychological warfare. It suggests omnipresence, technology, and godlike power. Hitler speaks in 3, sometimes 4 cities in a single day, a feat of physical endurance that leaves his opponents looking sluggish and outdated. Goebbels orchestrates the logistics with the precision of a military operation, ensuring that the plane lands exactly as the sun sets to maximize the dramatic effect. On the ground, Goebbels ensures that the voice of the movement penetrates every home and beer hall. He cannot yet control the state radio, which remains in the hands of the government, so he bypasses it. He produces thousands of small gramophone records, stamping the size of a postcard, which can be mailed cheaply to households across the Reich. People play these recordings in their living rooms, listening to Goebbels' sharp baritone and Hitler's hypnotic rasp. He also deploys a fleet of trucks equipped with film projectors and loudspeakers, bringing the Nazi message to rural villages that have never seen a politician in the flesh. The countryside is flooded with the swastika. The summer of 1932 sees the campaign reach a fever pitch of violence and hysteria. Goebbels writes in his diary that the street must belong to us, and he unleashes the SA to ensure it does. The Altona Bloody Sunday in July leaves 18 dead in a shootout between communists and police, an event Goebbels immediately spins as proof that the current government cannot maintain order. He thrives on the chaos, using the fear of civil war to stampede the middle class toward the Nazis. The July 31st election delivers a stunning victory, 230 seats. The Nazis are now the largest party in Germany, but they still lack an absolute majority to govern alone. However, the path to power is not a straight line. The months following the July victory are marked by stagnation and a dangerous loss of momentum. The party treasury is empty after 2 exhausting campaigns, and the public is growing weary of the perpetual electioneering. In the November 1932 elections, the Nazis actually lose 2 million votes. The aura of invincibility is cracked. Inside the party, panic sets in. Gregor Strasser, Goebbels' old rival, threatens to split the movement by accepting a position in the government without Hitler. For a few terrifying weeks in December, it seems the Nazi wave has crested and is beginning to recede. Goebbels sinks into a deep depression, his diaries filled with thoughts of suicide and failure. The future looks dark and gloomy. He writes, "All chances and hopes have quite disappeared." Yet, his instincts for survival remain sharp. He identifies a small state election in Lippe-Detmold in January 1933 as the lever to reverse their fortunes. It is a tiny, insignificant region, but Goebbels decides to treat it as the most important battle of the war. He floods the district with the entire Nazi leadership, saturating the villages with meetings and marches. He gambles everything on creating the illusion of a comeback. The strategy works. The Nazis win a symbolic victory in Lippe, and Goebbels' propaganda machine magnifies the result until it deafens the capital. He proclaims that the tide has turned, spooking the conservative elites in Berlin who were beginning to write Hitler off. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, a conspiracy is hatching. Former Chancellor Franz von Papen, driven by jealousy and a desire to regain power, convinces the aging President Hindenburg that Hitler can be tamed. They devise a plan to appoint Hitler as Chancellor with Papen as Vice-Chancellor, believing they can surround the Nazi leader with conservatives and use his popularity for their own ends. Goebbels watches these backroom dealings with a mixture of anxiety and contempt. He knows that Papen considers them to be vulgar upstarts, easily manipulated by the aristocracy. Papen famously boasts, "In 2 months, we'll have pushed Hitler so far into a corner that he'll squeak." Goebbels prepares the party for the final push, keeping the SA on high alert. The tension in Berlin is palpable. Rumors of a military coup or a general strike fly through the city. On the morning of January 30, 1933, Goebbels waits at the Kaiserhof Hotel, pacing the floor as Hitler goes to meet Hindenburg. The silence is agonizing. Then, the doors open. Hitler returns, his eyes wide with triumph. He has been named Chancellor of Germany. Goebbels bursts into tears of relief and joy. The long years of struggle, the rejection, the street fights, the near bankruptcy, it has all led to this moment. But he knows that the appointment is only the beginning. He must now visually cement this victory in the minds of the German people. He immediately orders a massive torchlight procession to march through the Brandenburg Gate that very evening. He wants to create an image that will burn itself into the retina of history. As night falls, the center of Berlin is transformed into a river of fire. 25,000 stormtroopers and SS men, carrying flaming torches, march in perfect formation past the chancellery window. Goebbels orchestrates the lighting and the camera angles, ensuring the newsreels capture the sheer scale of the event. The drums beat a hypnotic rhythm, and the boots strike the pavement with a thunderous sound that echoes off the government buildings. It is a display of disciplined power that signals the end of the chaotic Weimar era. The red Berlin he fought to conquer is now drowning in a sea of brown and swastikas. Hitler stands at the window, waving to the marching columns, while Goebbels watches from the background, his face illuminated by the flickering orange glow of the torches. He describes the scene in his diary as a fairy tale. The radio microphones broadcast the roar of the crowds to the entire nation, announcing the birth of a new era. For the average German listening at home, it sounds like the whole country is marching. Goebbels has successfully staged the Nazi seizure of power not as a political coalition, but as a national awakening. But amidst the celebration, Goebbels is already planning the next phase. He knows that holding power requires different weapons than seizing it. The Ministry of Propaganda is already taking shape in his mind, a vast apparatus that will control every newspaper, radio station, film studio, and theatre in the Reich. As the last torch fades into the night, Joseph Goebbels is no longer just an agitator. He is about to become the jailer of the German mind. The days of freedom are over. The days of coordination have begun. March 13, 1933. The decree is signed, and the ink is barely dry before Joseph Goebbels claims his prize. At the age of 35, he becomes the youngest minister in the cabinet, holding a title he invented for himself, Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. He moves his operations into the Leopold Palace on the Wilhelmstrasse, a grand 18th-century building that stands directly across from the Chancellery. The location is symbolic, placing him at the right hand of power. He walks through the gilded halls, ordering the removal of the dusty, aristocratic furniture. He replaces the old bureaucracy with a sleek, modern machine staffed by young fanatics. The time for street fighting is over. The time for state-sanctioned mind control has begun. Goebbels understands that power in the 20th century is not merely about controlling the police, but about controlling the nervous system of the nation. His philosophy is total. He declares that the government must not be content to leave the people alone. It must work on the people until they have capitulated to the Nazi worldview. He calls this process Gleichschaltung, or coordination. Every club, every newspaper, every radio station, and every theatre must vibrate at the same frequency. There can be no static, no interference, and absolutely no alternative signal. He sets out to build an apparatus that will make independent thought not just dangerous, but physically impossible. His first target is the radio, a technology he views as the spiritual weapon of the totalitarian state. The older, expensive radio sets are capable of picking up foreign broadcasts, which Goebbels considers a security risk. He commissions the production of the Volksempfänger VE 301, the People's Receiver. It is a masterpiece of industrial design, cheap, mass-produced, and deliberately limited in range. It can only receive local German stations. Goebbels ensures that these brown bakelite boxes find their way into every German living room, factory floor, and cafe. Now, when the Führer speaks, his voice does not just echo in a hall, it resonates simultaneously in 20 million homes, creating a unified national experience. Next, he turns his eyes to the press. The German newspaper industry was once the most vibrant in Europe, a cacophony of different political voices. Goebbels silences them with the passing of the editorial law in October 1933. This legislation strips publishers of their power and turns every journalist into a state employee. Editors are now legally responsible for ensuring that nothing in their pages contradicts the national interest as defined by the Nazis. Jewish and liberal journalists are purged overnight. The remaining writers are summoned to daily press conferences where they are told not only what to report, but exactly which words to use and where to place the articles on the page. But silencing the present is not enough. Goebbels intends to purge the past. On May 10, 1933, he orchestrates a ritual that will define the anti-intellectual barbarism of the regime. In university towns across Germany, students raid libraries and bookstores, hauling out works deemed un-German. They target books by Jewish authors, pacifists, socialists, and anyone who championed the liberal values of the Weimar Republic. In Berlin, a massive pyre is built in the Opernplatz, right across from the university. As night falls, a torrential rain begins to pour, threatening to dampen the flames. But the fire brigades pour gasoline onto the wood to ensure the destruction continues. Goebbels arrives in a limousine as the flames leap toward the wet sky. He steps out to face a crowd of 40,000 students and SA men, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of burning literature. He watches with a grim satisfaction as the works of Einstein, Freud, Marx, and Remarque are tossed into the inferno. He steps up to the microphone and delivers a eulogy for the old intellectualism. The era of extreme Jewish intellectualism is now at an end, he proclaims, his voice cutting through the crackle of the fire. From these ashes, the phoenix of a new spirit will rise. It is a declaration of war against the human mind. While he burns books, Goebbels seeks to seduce the masses through the silver screen. He is a genuine cinephile who understands that heavy-handed propaganda often bores the audience. He tells the film studios that he wants entertainment, not just marching soldiers. He nationalizes the film industry, effectively becoming the patron saint of German cinema. He bans anti-war masterpieces like All Quiet on the Western Front, claiming they destroy the soldierly spirit of the youth. In their place, he commissions historical epics and light comedies that subtly reinforce Nazi values. He wants the viewer to leave the theater feeling good about the Third Reich without realizing they have been indoctrinated. His relationship with the arts is complex and often contradictory. He champions the work of Leni Riefenstahl, a talented and ambitious young director. He gives her unlimited resources to film the 1934 Nuremberg Party rally. The result is Triumph of the Will, a technically brilliant piece of cinema that transforms a political convention into a religious event. Riefenstahl's cameras capture Hitler not as a politician, but as a descending god, framed against the sky and the stone masses of the stadium. Goebbels is jealous of her direct access to Hitler, but he recognizes the power of her work. He uses her images to sell the myth of Nazi unity to the world, masking the internal fractures of the party. Those fractures erupt violently in the summer of 1934. The SA, the very stormtroopers who helped Goebbels conquer Berlin, have become a liability. Their leader, Ernst Röhm, talks of a second revolution and threatens the stability of the army and the industrialists. Hitler decides to act. Goebbels, who once counted Röhm as an ally, switches sides with reptilian speed. He feeds Hitler false information about an imminent SA coup to accelerate the purge. On the night of the Long Knives, Goebbels is at Hitler's side as they fly to Munich to arrest Röhm. He watches as his old comrades are dragged out of their beds and executed. He creates the cover story for the press, painting the massacre as a necessary cleansing of corruption and homosexuality within the ranks. With the internal opposition crushed, Goebbels focuses on the complete Aryanization of German culture. He establishes the Reich Chamber of Culture, an organization that requires every artist, musician, writer, and actor to apply for membership. Without a membership card, one cannot work in Germany. The application process is a racial filter. Jewish artists are systematically rejected and banned from performing. Conductors are fired. Paintings are removed from gallery walls. And jazz music is banned as degenerate nigger noise. Goebbels effectively starves the Jewish cultural community, forcing many into exile while replacing them with mediocre talents who toe the party line. However, in 1936, the propaganda machine must perform a delicate pivot. Berlin is hosting the Olympic Games, and for 2 weeks, the Nazi regime is on display to the international community. Goebbels knows that the overt brutality of the regime could spark a boycott. He orders a temporary cleanup of the city. The virulently anti-Semitic signs that dot the parks and shops are taken down. The newspaper Der Stürmer, known for its grotesque caricatures of Jews, is removed from newsstands. He creates a Potemkin village of tolerance, instructing the police to treat foreign visitors with utmost courtesy. He wants the world to see a Germany that is disciplined, happy, and peaceful. The 936 Olympics become the greatest stage management of Goebbels' career. He ensures that the Games are a spectacle of grandeur that dwarfs all previous Olympiads. He oversees the construction of the massive Olympic Stadium and introduces the ritual of the torch relay, carrying fire from Athens to Berlin to link the Third Reich with ancient Greece. When the American sprinter Jesse Owens wins 4 gold medals, shattering the myth of Aryan supremacy, Goebbels ensures that the German press downplays the victories. He focuses instead on the overall medal count, where Germany leads, and the flawless organization of the event. The world leaves Berlin impressed, many visitors duped into believing that Hitler is a man of peace. Behind the scenes of the Olympic spectacle, Goebbels is pioneering a new medium: television. Germany begins the world's first regular television service, broadcasting the Games to special viewing parlors across Berlin. The image is grainy and the screens are small, but the implication is clear. Goebbels envisions a future where the state can project its image not just through sound, but through live video into every home. He speaks of television as the ultimate tool of unification, dreaming of a day when the entire nation can visually participate in the Führer's life. He is always looking for the next technological edge to tighten his grip. In 1937, Goebbels turns his attention back to the visual arts with a malicious project. He organizes 2 exhibitions in Munich. The first is the Great German Art Exhibition, showcasing the approved, sterile realism of Nazi art, muscular peasants, nude Aryan women, and busts of the Führer. Across the park, he opens the Degenerate Art Exhibition. Here, he displays the confiscated works of modern masters like Picasso, Klee, and Chagall. The paintings are hung crookedly, surrounded by graffiti mocking the artists as insane or Jewish perverts. He hires actors to mingle with the crowd and shout insults at the art. The exhibition is designed to incite hatred against modernism, and millions flock to see it, far outnumbering the visitors to the approved art show. Despite his immense power, Goebbels' personal life begins to fray, threatening his position. He is a notorious womanizer, using his power over the film industry to coerce young actresses into his bed. In 1938, he falls deeply in love with the Czech actress Lida Barova. He is ready to leave his wife, Magda, and resign his post to live with Barova. But Magda is the First Lady of the Reich, a close friend of Hitler, and the mother of Goebbels' 6 children, who are used constantly in propaganda photos. She appeals directly to the Führer. Hitler, who cannot tolerate a scandal in his inner circle, forbids the divorce. He orders Goebbels to end the affair and return to his wife. Goebbels is devastated and humiliated. He writes in his diary that life is no longer worth living, but he obeys. He sends Barova away and returns to the ministry, a broken man who must now work twice as hard to regain his master's favor. He throws himself into his work with a renewed, almost suicidal intensity. He realizes that his only purpose, his only source of worth, comes from his service to Hitler. He needs a crisis, something violent and radical, to prove his loyalty and wash away the stain of his infidelity. He begins to look for an excuse to unleash the full fury of the state against the Jews. By late 1938, the consolidation is complete. The radio, the press, the cinema, and the arts speak with one voice. The German people have been sealed inside an information bubble, cut off from the reality of the outside world. They have been fed a diet of victimhood and glory, told that they are surrounded by enemies and that their only hope lies in blind obedience to the Führer. The ministry runs like a fine-tuned engine, responding instantly to the twist of Goebbels' dial. He has prepared the mind of the nation for the ultimate test. The Minister of Peace is now ready to become the drummer of war. November 7, 1938. Joseph Goebbels is a man on the precipice of political exile. The Barova scandal has left him isolated, his relationship with Hitler frosty and distant. He sits in his office, desperate for a lever to pry his way back into the Führer's inner circle. When a telegram arrives from Paris, a 17-year-old Polish Jew named Herschel Grinspan has walked into the German embassy and shot diplomat Ernst von Rath. Goebbels instantly recognizes that this is not a tragedy, it is a lifeline. He rushes to the chancellery to present the news to Hitler, framing the assassination not as the act of a desperate teenager, but as the opening shot of a global Jewish conspiracy against the Reich. 2 days later, on November 9, the Nazi leadership gathers in the Old Town Hall of Munich to commemorate the anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch. During the dinner, news arrives that von Rath has died of his wounds. Hitler leans in, whispers intense instructions to Goebbels, and then abruptly leaves the hall. The room falls silent. Goebbels takes the podium, his voice trembling with calculated rage. He informs the assembled Gauleiters that the world Jewry has struck a blow against Germany. He declares that while the party will not organize public demonstrations, it will certainly not oppose spontaneous eruptions of popular anger. The message is cryptic to the uninitiated, but to the men in the room, it is a direct order to burn everything down. The phones begin to ring across the Reich as the party leaders rush to their local headquarters. The orders are passed down the chain of command. The SA is to launch a massive pogrom, but they must wear civilian clothes to look like outraged citizens. The police are ordered to stand down. The fire brigades are told to protect only Aryan property. By midnight, Germany is ablaze. Synagogues that have stood for centuries are torched, their sacred scrolls thrown into the gutters. Jewish shop windows are smashed with sledgehammers, the shards of glass glittering on the pavement under the streetlights, giving the night its infamous name Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Goebbels monitors the destruction from his hotel room, receiving reports of burning buildings and beaten Jews with the excitement of a pyromaniac. He writes in his diary that the dear Jews are getting a bit of a wash. The violence is horrific. 91 Jews are murdered, and 30,000 are rounded up and dragged off to concentration camps. The next morning, Goebbels surveys the damage, not with remorse, but with a bureaucratic coldness. He holds a press conference blaming the Jews for their own misfortune. He announces a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks to be paid by the German Jewish community to the state as reparations for the murder in Paris. He has successfully turned the victims into the perpetrators. With his position restored, Goebbels pivots his propaganda machine toward the coming war. By the summer of 1939, the target is Poland. He employs the same atrocity propaganda he used against the communists. The newspapers scream headlines about Polish terror and the martyrdom of ethnic Germans living across the border. He fabricates stories of castration, rape, and mass murder, whipping the German public into a frenzy of victimhood. He needs the people to believe that the invasion is an act of self-defense, a necessary police action to stop a savage neighbor. He bans the listening of foreign radio stations, making it a capital crime to tune into the BBC. He is sealing the ears of the nation. On September 1, 1939, the Wehrmacht crosses the Polish border, and the world holds its breath. Goebbels unleashes a new weapon of information warfare, the propaganda, company and PK units. These are soldiers trained as cameramen and journalists, armed with rifles and film reels. They travel with the frontline troops, capturing stylized, heroic footage of the German advance. Goebbels edits this raw material in Berlin, creating the Die Deutsche Wochenschau, the German weekly review. These newsreels are not journalism, they are action movies starring the German army. They show tanks crushing obstacles and Stukas diving like birds of prey, creating an image of technological invincibility that terrifies the world. The conquest of Poland is swift, followed by the phony war. But in the spring of 1940, the German war machine turns west. The victories come with dizzying speed: Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and finally, France. As the swastika is hoisted over the Eiffel Tower, Goebbels faces a unique problem: victory intoxication. The German people are euphoric, believing the war is effectively over. Goebbels has to walk a fine line, celebrating the triumphs of the greatest warlord of all time, Hitler, while warning the public that the final victory against England is still to come. He choreographs the armistice signing at Compiègne in the same railway carriage where Germany surrendered in 1918, a masterstroke of historical revenge. However, the Battle of Britain proves that the propaganda weapon has limits. Goebbels cannot film a victory that isn't happening. As the Luftwaffe fails to break the RAF, and British bombers begin to appear over Berlin, the mood in the capital sours. Goebbels shifts the narrative from offense to defense. He begins to characterize the British leadership, specifically Winston Churchill, as drunkards and war criminals who target innocent civilians. He visits the bombed-out neighborhoods of Berlin, not to offer platitudes, but to harden the hearts of the survivors. He turns the rubble into a symbol of British barbarism, promising that for every bomb dropped on Berlin, 10 will fall on London. While the bombs fall, Goebbels launches a cinematic assault on the Jews that surpasses anything seen before. In September 1940, he premieres the film Judd Seuss at the Venice Film Festival. Unlike dry political speeches, this is a high-budget historical melodrama designed to bypass the intellect and trigger a visceral, emotional revulsion. The film depicts a Jewish character raping a virtuous German woman and corrupting a duchy. Goebbels makes attendance mandatory for the SS and the police. Reports flood in of audiences leaving the theaters screaming curses at Jews they see on the street. It is a mass conditioning experiment, desensitizing the population to the violence that is about to escalate. He follows this with the pseudo-documentary Der ewige Jude, The Eternal Jew. If Judd Seuss was a melodrama, this film is a slaughterhouse tour. Goebbels uses footage shot in the Polish ghettos, showing starving, filthy Jews in squalid conditions, stripped of all dignity. He creates a montage that cuts between images of Jews and swarms of rats spreading disease. The narration is clinical and detached, describing the Jewish people not as humans, but as a bacillus that must be eliminated for the health of the social body. Goebbels is no longer just preaching segregation. He is providing the visual and moral justification for genocide. He is preparing the German conscience for the unthinkable. As 1941 dawns, Goebbels is heavily involved in the deception campaign for Operation Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union, he needs to keep Stalin guessing. He writes a famous article titled The Example of Crete, heavily implying that the next German airborne assault will be against Britain. He then stages a fake confiscation of his own newspaper to make foreign intelligence believe he accidentally leaked a state secret. The ruse works perfectly. While the world looks at the English Channel, 3 million German soldiers quietly assemble on the eastern border. Goebbels enjoys this game of shadows, proving that he can manipulate foreign governments as easily as his own people. On June 22, 1941, the radio announcers break the silence with fanfare. Germany has invaded the Soviet Union. Goebbels frames this new war not as a conquest of territory, but as a crusade to save Western civilization from the Jewish Bolshevik hordes. The early weeks bring staggering news of victories, with hundreds of thousands of Soviet prisoners taken. Goebbels' headlines scream of army groups annihilated and the imminent collapse of the Red Army. He fosters a sense of supreme arrogance, believing his own propaganda that the Soviet structure is a rotten house that will collapse with one kick. The German public begins to dream of vast estates in the east, but as the summer turns to autumn, the tone of the reports begins to change. The Red Army fights with a tenacity that the propaganda had claimed was impossible for subhumans. The mud of the Russian autumn slows the tanks, and the distances swallow the supplies. Goebbels begins to see the cracks in the Blitzkrieg narrative. He advises Hitler to prepare the people for a longer struggle, but the Führer is convinced Moscow will fall before winter. Goebbels is forced to maintain a facade of inevitable victory, even as the letters from the front lines describe a hellscape of fire and resistance that contradicts the newsreels. In September 1941, Goebbels takes a decisive step toward the final solution. He meets with Hitler and pushes for the visible branding of German Jews. The decree is issued: every Jew over the age of 6 must wear a yellow star with the word Jude stitched on the left side of their chest. Goebbels wants to isolate them socially, to make them walking targets for the public's frustration. Simultaneously, the first evacuations of Berlin's Jews begin. They are herded onto trains heading east. Goebbels knows exactly what awaits them in the forests of Latvia and Lithuania. He writes in his diary, the Jews are now being packed off to the east. A judgment is being visited upon them that, while barbaric, is fully deserved. By December 1941, the reality of the war crashes down on the Third Reich. The German offensive freezes at the gates of Moscow in temperatures of 40 below zero. The soldiers, lacking winter uniforms, are dying of frostbite. Then, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, and Hitler declares war on the United States. Germany is now fighting a world war on multiple fronts. Goebbels realizes that the era of lightning war is dead. He launches the Winter Relief Campaign, frantically collecting furs and woolens from civilians to send to the freezing troops. He stands before the microphone, no longer promising easy glory, but demanding sacrifice. The Minister of Lies must now teach the nation how to suffer. January 1943. A freezing wind howls through the shattered windows of the propaganda ministry, mirroring the chill that has settled over the German soul. Joseph Goebbels paces his office, the floor littered with frantic teletypes from the Eastern Front. The news from Stalingrad is catastrophic. The entire Sixth Army, the pride of the Wehrmacht, is trapped in a cauldron of ice and fire, slowly being strangled by the Red Army. For weeks, Goebbels has forbidden the press from using the word encirclement, offering vague reports of heavy defensive fighting. But he knows the silence can no longer be maintained. The death notices are arriving in German mailboxes by the thousands, and the whispers in the breadlines are louder than the radio broadcasts. He faces a dilemma that would paralyze a lesser propagandist: how to announce a defeat of biblical proportions without causing a national collapse. Goebbels decides to gamble everything on a psychological pivot. Instead of denying the disaster, he will embrace it. He will use the tragedy of Stalingrad to shock the German people out of their lethargy. He crafts a narrative of heroic sacrifice, comparing the soldiers in the ruins of Stalingrad to the ancient Spartans at Thermopylae. They are not dying in vain. They are sacrificing themselves to hold back the Asiatic flood long enough for Europe to wake up. He prepares the nation not for victory, but for a fight for existence. On February 18, 1943, Goebbels stages the most famous performance of his life at the Berlin Sportpalast. The hall is packed with 14,000 hand-picked loyalists, wounded soldiers, party functionaries, and war workers instructed to applaud on cue. A giant banner hangs above the stage. Total war is the shortest war. Goebbels steps up to the podium, looking gaunt and feverish. He speaks for over 2 hours, his voice rising from a calm analysis to a screaming crescendo. He paints a terrifying picture of what will happen if the Bolsheviks win: the enslavement of the population, the rape of women, and the eradication of German culture. Then comes the moment of truth. Goebbels leans into the microphone, his eyes burning with fanaticism, and poses 10 questions to the audience. "Do you want total war?" he screams. "If necessary, do you want a war more total and radical than anything that we can even imagine today?" The crowd erupts in a frenzy, jumping to their feet, raising their arms, and roaring yes. It is a masterclass in mass manipulation. Goebbels has forced them to complicity by screaming yes. They have psychologically committed themselves to the bitter end. He wipes the sweat from his forehead, looking out at the sea of ecstatic faces. He has successfully transformed fear into fanaticism. Following the speech, Goebbels is energized. He believes he now has the mandate to radicalize the home front. He demands the closure of luxury restaurants, high-end fashion boutiques, and beauty parlors, arguing that in a time of total war, no one has the right to luxury. He pushes for the conscription of women into the factories, a measure Hitler has long resisted due to his traditional views on gender. Goebbels fights a constant bureaucratic war against the other Nazi leaders, particularly Hermann Göring, whom he views as a lazy, drug-addled incompetent who has let the Luftwaffe rot. Goebbels wants to turn Germany into a Spartan fortress, stripping away everything that does not serve the war effort. While the armies bleed in the east, the war comes home to the German cities. The Allied bombing campaign intensifies, turning night into day with incendiary bombs. Hamburg burns in a firestorm in the summer of 1943, killing 40,000 civilians in a single night. Berlin is pounded relentlessly, while Hitler retreats to the safety of his bunkers in East Prussia, refusing to visit the bombed cities or even look at photos of the destruction. Goebbels does the opposite. He stays in the capital, touring the smoking ruins immediately after the raids. He climbs over the rubble, meets with the homeless, and hands out chocolate and cigarettes. He cultivates a new persona, the patron saint of the ruins. He ensures the newsreels capture him standing amidst the devastation, wearing a simple leather trench coat, listening to the grievances of the people. This is his finest hour as a politician. The people of Berlin, known for their cynicism, begin to respect his physical courage. He uses the bombings to fuel a narrative of hate. He points to the destroyed churches and hospitals as proof that the British and Americans are air gangsters intent on genocide. The walls may break, he writes in Das Reich, but our hearts will not. He turns the rubble into a monument of defiance. However, the internal stability of the regime is more fragile than it appears. On July 20, 1944, a group of army officers attempts to assassinate Hitler at the Wolf's Lair. The bomb explodes, and although Hitler survives, the confusion is total. Operation Valkyrie is triggered, and rebel troops begin to seize control of the government quarter in Berlin. They surround the propaganda ministry. Goebbels sits in his office, looking out the window at the soldiers who have come to arrest him. He has a cyanide capsule in his pocket, but he does not swallow it. He decides to bluff his way out of the executioner's grasp. Major Otto Remmer, the commander of the Berlin Guard Battalion, enters Goebbels' office with orders to arrest him. Goebbels, calm and icy, asks the major if he is sure the Führer is dead. Remmer confirms it. Goebbels then picks up the phone and asks the operator to connect him to the Wolf's Lair. Within seconds, he hands the receiver to the stunned major. Hitler's voice crackles down the line. Unmistakable and alive, he promotes Remmer on the spot and orders him to crush the rebellion. In that single moment, Goebbels saves the Third Reich. He transitions instantly from prisoner to prosecutor, unleashing a wave of vengeance against the conspirators. The failure of the July 20 plot gives Goebbels exactly what he has always wanted: total power over the domestic war effort. Hitler, now paranoid and trusting no one but his faithful Joseph, appoints him plenipotentiary for total war. Goebbels finally has the authority to bypass the other ministers. He combs through the bureaucracy, the theatres, and the universities, dragging every able-bodied man out of civilian life and sending them to the front. He creates the Volkssturm, a people's militia of old men and teenage boys, armed with Panzerfausts and told to defend their hometowns to the death. It is a desperate, murderous improvisation, as 1944 bleeds into 1945. The propaganda becomes increasingly surreal. The Red Army is pushing into East Prussia, and the Americans are at the borders of the Reich. Goebbels can no longer promise victory in the conventional sense. Instead, he speaks of miracle weapons, the V-2 rockets and the new jet fighters that will turn the tide at the last minute. He delves into history, drawing parallels with the 7 Years' War, where Frederick the Great was saved from total defeat by the sudden death of the Russian Tsarina. He casts Hitler as the modern Frederick, a lonely genius standing against the world, waiting for a miracle that destiny owes him. He also begins to prepare the German people for a collective suicide pact. He introduces the concept of werewolf units, partisan fighters who will operate behind enemy lines. The rhetoric shifts from survival to destruction. If we are going to go down, he tells his associates, we will drag the whole world down with us. He commissions a color film, Kohlberg, the most expensive movie ever made in Nazi Germany. It depicts a town that burns itself to the ground rather than surrender to Napoleon. He orders thousands of soldiers to be pulled off the front lines to serve as extras in the film, believing that the cinematic image of sacrifice is more important than the tactical reality. The atmosphere in the ministry is macabre. Goebbels works 18-hour days, his face a skull-like mask, his skin yellowed by jaundice. He is consuming a cocktail of drugs to keep going. He knows the end is near. He begins to move his personal archives, his precious diaries, to safety, ensuring they are microfilmed and buried. He is obsessed with how history will judge him. He wants to be remembered not as a failure, but as a man who remained loyal when all others fled. He speaks of the coming downfall not with fear, but with a strange, nihilistic aestheticism. He views the burning of Germany as a grand Wagnerian finale. In the final months of 1944, he visits the front lines on the Oder River, just 50 miles from Berlin. He sees the terrified faces of the Volkssturm boys, shivering in their thin coats, holding rifles they barely know how to aim. He does not offer them strategy, he offers them fanaticism. He tells them that the enemy is a horde of beasts who will defile their mothers and sisters. He tries to instill a fear greater than death, but privately. He admits to his aides that the military situation is hopeless. His only goal now is to script the end of the Third Reich so that it becomes a myth for future generations. As Christmas 1944 approaches, the mood in Berlin is funereal. There are no lights, no festivities, only the rumble of distant artillery and the wail of sirens. Goebbels delivers a Christmas address that is stark and joyless. He speaks of the hard times and the test of character. He sits by the radio with his wife and children, the perfect Nazi family, posing for the last time. He looks at his children Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holde, Hedda, and Heide and makes a chilling decision. They will not grow up in a world without National Socialism. The logic of his propaganda has reached its ultimate, horrific conclusion if the idea dies. The people must die with it. The year ends with the Third Reich shrinking by the day. The Ardennes offensive has failed. The Russians are preparing their final lunge at Berlin. Goebbels packs his bags. He is leaving his grand residence, his luxury, and his ministry. He is moving into the Führerbunker, deep beneath the Chancellery garden. He is going to join his Messiah for the final act. The stage is set for the Götterdämmerung. The man who spent 20 years speaking to millions will now end his life in a concrete box. Surrounded by the silence of the dead. April 20, 1945. The atmosphere inside the Führerbunker is a suffocating mixture of sewage, diesel fumes, and concrete dust. 50 feet beneath the garden of the Reich Chancellery, the leaders of the 1,000-year Reich have been reduced to troglodytes. Joseph Goebbels navigates the cramped, maze-like corridors to pay his respects on Hitler's 56th birthday. Above them, the Red Army has encircled Berlin, and the ground shakes rhythmically with the impact of Soviet artillery shells. Goebbels watches as the Nazi elite scramble for the exits, desperate to flee north or south before the trap snaps shut. He looks at them with undisguised contempt, while rats flee a sinking ship. The captain and his most loyal officer will remain. 2 days later, on April 22, Hitler suffers a nervous collapse during the military conference. He screams that the war is lost, that his generals have betrayed him, and that he will stay in Berlin to the end. This is the signal Goebbels has been waiting for. He immediately moves his wife, Magda, and their 6 children into the bunker. They occupy a suite of rooms in the Vorbunker, the upper level of the complex. The arrival of the children Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holder, Hedda, and Heide injects a surreal element of domestic normalcy into the tomb. They play games in the corridors, their laughter echoing off the cold concrete walls, blissfully unaware that they have been brought here not to be saved, but to be sacrificed. Magda Goebbels is the steel spine of the family during these final days. She is calm, perfectly groomed, and utterly resolved. She wears the golden party badge that Hitler, in a gesture of profound gratitude, pinned to her dress just days earlier. She sits with Traudl Jung, Hitler's secretary, and explains her terrifying logic. She believes that the world that will come after the National Socialist idea is not worth living in. She refuses to let her children grow up in a Germany stripped of honor, likely to be paraded as freakish curiosities by the victors. For Magda, infanticide is not a crime. It is a final act of maternal protection against a corrupted future. Goebbels spends his time pacing the lower bunker, his limp more pronounced due to exhaustion. He is no longer broadcasting to the nation. The transmitters are being overrun one by one. His audience has shrunk to the few dozen people trapped in this concrete box. He spends hours with Hitler, reminiscing about the old days of struggle, the street fights in 1926, and the great triumphs of the early 30s. They feed each other's delusions, moving phantom armies on maps that no longer correspond to reality. Goebbels sees himself as the chronicler of this twilight of the gods. He believes that by dying here, they are sowing the seeds for a future resurrection of the movement in 100 years. On April 29, the mood shifts from desperation to finality. Hitler marries Eva Braun in a brief, grim civil ceremony. Goebbels serves as the best man. Shortly after, Hitler dictates his last will and political testament. In a final act of loyalty, He expels the traitors Goering and Himmler from the party and appoints Joseph Goebbels as his successor as Reich Chancellor. It is a hollow title, the chancellorship of a graveyard. But Goebbels accepts it with solemn pride. He adds a postscript to the testament, stating that for the first time in his life, he must disobey an order from the Führer. Hitler ordered him to leave Berlin, but Goebbels writes that he will stay to end his life at the side of the Führer. The afternoon of April 30 brings the sound of a single gunshot, followed by the smell of bitter almonds and cordite. Hitler is dead. Goebbels is now the Chancellor of Germany. His tenure will last less than 30 hours. He stands at attention as the bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun are carried up the stairs to the garden to be burned. He watches through the open bunker door as the flames consume the man he worshipped for 20 years. With the sun of his universe extinguished, Goebbels feels the cold reality of the end closing in. He returns to the conference room, his face a mask of stone. There is one final piece of business to attend to the diplomatic exit. Goebbels attempts a futile negotiation with the Soviets. He sends General Hans Krebs, who speaks Russian, to deliver a letter to General Chuikov, the commander of the Soviet 8th Guards Army. The letter informs Chuikov of Hitler's death and requests a ceasefire. Goebbels hopes that the Soviets might recognize his new government and allow them a dignified surrender. The reply comes back hours later. Blunt and uncompromising, unconditional surrender only. There will be no deals, no escape, and no political survival. Goebbels throws the paper down. I will not sign a surrender document. He snaps. I will never do that. The time for politics is over. The time for the final horror has arrived. It is the afternoon of May 1945. Magda puts the children to bed in their small room. She tells them they need a vaccination to keep them healthy for the long journey ahead. The children, trusting their mother implicitly, accept the story. Only the eldest, 12-year-old Helga, seems to sense the darkness gathering around them. Her eyes are wide with fear, but she says nothing. An SS dentist, Dr. Helmut Kuntz, is brought in to administer morphine injections to sedate the children. He hesitates, his hand shaking, but Magda's gaze is withering. Under her supervision, he injects the 6 children, and they slowly drift into a deep, drug-induced sleep. Once the children are unconscious, the final stage begins. Magda cannot bring herself to crush the cyanide ampoules alone. She asks Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger, Hitler's personal surgeon, to help her. They enter the room together. The details of what happens next are shrouded in the silence of the grave, but the outcome is clear. One by one, the glass capsules of cyanide are crushed between the teeth of the sleeping children. Forensic evidence suggests that Helga woke up as the poison took effect. She has bruising on her face, indicating a brief, terrified struggle against her executioners. Within minutes, the 6 Goebbels children are dead, arranged neatly in their white nightclothes, their future stolen by their parents' fanaticism. Goebbels waits outside. When Magda emerges, her face is pale and ghost-like. She sits at a table and plays a game of solitaire, her hands moving mechanically. Goebbels puts on his hat, his scarf, and his long leather coat. He puts on his gloves, covering his hands for the last time. It is around 8:30 p.m. They bid farewell to the remaining staff in the bunker. There are no tearful scenes, only a brisk, business-like detachment. Goebbels tells his adjutant, Gunther Schweigmann, that they will go up to the garden to commit suicide and that Schweigmann must ensure their bodies are burned so they are not put on display by the Russians. They climb the concrete stairs, leaving the artificial light of the bunker for the twilight of the burning city. The air in the Chancellery garden is thick with smoke and the smell of death. The Soviet shells are pounding the government quarter relentlessly, throwing up geysers of earth and stone. Joseph and Magda stand near the emergency exit. It is a fitting stage for the propaganda minister, a ruined backdrop of the empire he helped destroy. Magda bites into a cyanide capsule and collapses. Goebbels, ever the director, shoots her in the head to ensure she is dead, then turns the Walther pistol on himself. He bites his own capsule and pulls the trigger simultaneously. Schweigmann and the SS orderly, obeying their final orders, pour several jerrycans of petrol over the bodies. They strike a match, and the flames roar up, licking at the leather trench coat and the silk dress. However, the petrol is insufficient to completely cremate the remains, and the shelling forces the men to retreat back into the safety of the bunker. The bodies are left smouldering in the shell crater, only partially destroyed. The patron saint of the ruins becomes part of the debris field he created. The voice that once commanded the attention of millions is finally reduced to ash and silence. On May 2, the Russians overrun the chancellery. A Soviet soldier spots the charred remains in the garden. They are identifiable only by the metal brace on Joseph's right leg and the golden party badge on Magda's chest. Down in the bunker, they find the children, the soldiers, men who have fought their way from Stalingrad to Berlin and seen every horror imaginable, stop in stunned silence at the sight of the 6 sleeping bodies. The unnatural peace of the scene disturbs them more than the carnage above. It is the ultimate testament to the warp of ideology that a father could love his Führer more than his own flesh and blood. Joseph Goebbels spent his life manipulating the truth, building a monument of lies to sustain a regime of terror. In the end, his death was his final propaganda piece, a calculated attempt to forge a myth of loyalty and martyrdom. But history strips away the myth. What remains is not a tragedy of operatic grandeur, but a sordid, brutal crime in a dirty hole in the ground. The man who unleashed the storm was consumed by it, leaving behind nothing but a broken nation, a murdered family, and a name that would become an eternal synonym for the manipulation of the human mind. The script ends here, in the rubble of Berlin,